My name is Conrad, and I am 21 years old. I reside in the rural expanse of Ohio, where life unfolds at a leisurely pace and the nights are adorned with a vast canopy of stars. The rhythm of life here is deeply rooted in tradition. I am Amish, having been raised in this way of life alongside my family and the members of our close-knit community. Our existence is characterized by simplicity. There are no electric lights, no automobiles, and minimal distractions from the outside world. It is a tranquil life, filled with diligent labor and steadfast faith. However, beneath this simplicity lies a complexity that I have carried in solitude for as long as I can remember. I have always felt different from those around me, as if I do not conform to the expectations set for me. While many young men in my community aspire to marry and establish families, my thoughts diverge onto a path that I have been taught to fear and suppress. I have known my sexual orientation since my teenage years, yet I have never found the courage to voice it. In our community, such feelings are not only discouraged but deemed sinful, something to be concealed, prayed away, or punished. Consequently, I have buried my secret deep within, striving to blend in and hoping that my truth remains undiscovered. This facade was challenging to maintain, particularly after my stepfather Jacob entered my life. He married my mother when I was 16, shortly after the passing of my biological father. Jacob is a robust and stoic man, his hands roughened from years of laboring on the land. Despite his reserved nature, he possesses an unspoken authority that commands respect. Initially, our relationship was somewhat distant. Jacob was not one to openly express affection, and I was not inclined to seek it. However, as time went on, our interactions began to evolve. We found ourselves working together more frequently, tending to the fields, repairing the barn, and chopping wood. Though our conversations were few, a growing sense of understanding developed between us, creating a bond that felt unexpectedly comforting. Recently, I have started to notice subtle changes in his demeanor, which have left me contemplating the nature of our relationship. Jacob's furtive glances when he believed I was unaware, the way his hand would inadvertently brush against mine while we exchanged tools. Initially, I dismissed these occurrences, attributing them to my own vivid imagination. However, the indications became increasingly difficult to overlook. There were instances when Jacob's gaze would linger just a moment too long, his expression inscrutable, yet laden with an emotion I struggled to identify. I once caught him observing me as I worked shirtless in the summer heat, his eyes following my every movement before he quickly averted his gaze. Yet deep down, I could not shake the sensation that Jacob saw through my facade, that he understood the secret I had endeavored to conceal. Then came the night that altered everything. It was late and the house was tranquil, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards as Jacob and I concluded our chores after dinner. My mother had already retired for the night, leaving just the two of us in the softly illuminated kitchen. "You have been working hard lately," Jacob remarked, his voice low yet steady as he leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. I nodded, uncertain of how to reply. "There is always work to be done," I stated, maintaining a neutral tone. He scrutinized me for a moment, his gaze unwavering yet gentle. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said after a brief pause. "Quiet, always contemplating." His words took me by surprise, causing my heart to race. "Is that a good thing?" I inquired, my voice softer than I had intended. Jacob's lips formed a subtle smile, but his eyes conveyed a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "It can be," he replied, his voice gentle yet imbued with significance. "It depends on what you are contemplating." The atmosphere between us became charged, the unspoken tension thickening with each fleeting second. I found myself at a loss for words, unsure of how to disrupt the silence that felt interminable. Then, without warning, Jacob extended his hand, lightly brushing against my arm. It was a simple gesture, yet it sent a surge of electricity through me, causing my breath to catch. As I raised my eyes to meet his, he softly remarked, "You don't have to bear this burden alone." His voice barely audible. I was uncertain of his meaning, not fully grasping it. Yet the significance of his words resonated deeply within me, awakening an emotion I struggled to identify. That moment marked the beginning of a transformation, although I was unaware of the extent to which my life would change. The days following that evening in the kitchen became a haze of furtive glances and subtle changes. I found myself repeatedly contemplating Jacob's words. "You don't have to carry it alone." What did he intend to convey? Was he attempting to communicate something significant, or was I merely projecting my own wishes onto his words? However, his actions spoke volumes. Those lingering touches, the way his gaze would capture mine and linger just a moment too long before he would look away. It was clear that this was not merely a figment of my imagination. Jacob recognized something within me, and I could sense the connection between us intensifying with each day. It was not until the following week that the situation began to escalate. We had spent the afternoon in the barn, mending a broken beam that had been at risk of collapsing under the weight of the loft. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, and by the time we completed our task, we were both soaked in sweat, our shirts clinging to our skin. Leaning against the beam we had just secured, Jacob wiped his brow with the back of his hand and remarked, "Good work today," his tone low and steady. I responded with a breathless, "Thanks," still recovering from the exertion. He observed me for a moment, his gaze tracing the contours of my face before drifting downward, lingering on my chest. "You're strong," he said quietly. "You've grown a lot over the past few years." I felt my cheeks flush under his scrutiny, a peculiar blend of pride and nervous energy surging through me. "Just trying to keep up," I replied, forcing a light laugh. Jacob did not respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, the space between us diminishing until I could feel the warmth emanating from his body. His hand reached out. Resting lightly on my shoulder, his touch was both firm and gentle. "You are more than just strong, Conrad," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "You possess a good heart and a good soul." My breath caught in my throat and my chest tightened as the weight of his words enveloped me. "Jacob," I began, but I struggled to find the right words to respond to the intensity of his gaze and the quiet power in his voice. "You don't have to hide from me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see you, Conrad. I have always seen you." His words struck me like a thunderclap, revealing the unspoken truth between us. I felt my legs weaken, my hands trembling as I tried to comprehend what was unfolding. I started, but the words eluded me. "It's okay," Jacob reassured me, moving his hand from my shoulder to the side of my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "You don't have to say anything." The barn was silent except for the sound of our breathing and the faint rustle of hay beneath our feet. The tension in the air thickened, the space between us shrinking until it felt as though the rest of the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us in this charged, unspoken moment. Slowly and tentatively, Jacob leaned in, his forehead brushing against mine. His breath was warm and steady, and I found myself instinctively leaning into him, drawn to the quiet strength of his presence. "Tell me if this isn't okay," he murmured, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability I had never witnessed in him before. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as I met his gaze. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile before he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, and filled with unspoken emotion. My eyes fluttered closed as warmth surged through me, my hands finding their way to his chest as I leaned into him, releasing the fear and doubt that had held me back for so long. When we finally pulled apart, Jacob. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands gently cradling my face. "We will take this slow," he said softly, his voice steady yet thick with emotion. "Whatever this is, we will figure it out together." I nodded, feeling a tightness in my chest from a blend of fear and exhilaration. "Okay," I replied quietly. In that moment, I realized there was no turning back. After that first kiss in the barn, everything between Jacob and me changed. The once innocent moments we shared, working side by side, sitting in silence after a long day, our hands brushing as we passed tools, were now imbued with a quiet intensity that neither of us could ignore. We never openly discussed what had transpired, but our actions spoke volumes. There was a newfound closeness, an unspoken understanding that we shared something neither of us could fully articulate or resist. One evening, about a week later, Jacob asked for my assistance in repairing the fence along the edge of our property. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson as we worked amidst the tranquil approach of night. "Conrad," Jacob said softly, breaking the silence. I looked up, my hands pausing on the section of fence I had been hammering. "Yeah?" I replied, sensing his hesitation. His gaze was steady but laced with uncertainty. "Do you ever think about leaving?" "Leaving?" I echoed, confused. "The community," he clarified, his tone measured. "Starting over somewhere else where things aren't so complicated." The question took me by surprise, and for a moment I was at a loss for words. "I've thought about it," I finally admitted. "But it's not that simple." Jacob nodded, his expression contemplative. "Nothing worth having ever is." His words lingered in the air, the weight of them settling between us. Gradually, he set down his hammer and stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You're strong, Conrad," he said softly. "Stronger than you think." I swallowed hard, my heart racing as he reached out, brushing his hand lightly against my arm. "You don't have to face this alone," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The atmosphere surrounding us became dense with unspoken tension, an invisible force drawing us nearer. Jacob's hand glided down my arm, his fingers delicately wrapping around my wrist as he stepped closer. "Jacob," I uttered, my voice quivering as I struggled to steady my breath. He remained silent, yet his gaze locked onto mine with a profound intensity that sent a shiver coursing through me. Gradually, he lifted my hand, his thumb gliding over my knuckles in a gesture so gentle it left me breathless. "I have been waiting for you to notice me," he said softly, his voice laden with emotion. A mixture of fear and exhilaration surged within me as I closed the gap between us. "I see you," I whispered, my voice barely rising above a murmur. Jacob offered a faint smile before his lips met mine, the kiss deepening and becoming more urgent. His hands found their way to my waist, drawing me closer, while my own hands clutched his shoulders, as if afraid I might drift away if I released my grip. The world around us faded into the background, the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets becoming mere echoes against the heat and intensity of our connection. Each touch, each whispered breath felt like a revelation, an exploration of something we had both yearned for but hesitated to claim. As the kiss intensified, Jacob's hands traveled upward, tracing the curve of my back before resting at the nape of my neck. His touch was both firm and gentle, guiding me with a quiet assurance that made me feel both secure and utterly vulnerable. "You are incredible," he murmured against my lips, his voice imbued with reverence that sent warmth flooding through me. Unsure of how to reply, I leaned into him, allowing my actions to convey what words could not. My hands explored his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my palms, a grounding reminder that this moment was tangible, that we were indeed real. The sun had long set beyond the horizon, leaving us enveloped in the soft glow of moonlight as we stood together in the stillness of the night. Jacob spoke softly, his forehead resting against mine. I echoed his sentiment, my voice steady despite the tumult of emotions swirling within me. In that moment, I realized that whatever challenges awaited us, we would confront them together, united by a bond that transcended the expectations of our world. The days that followed our encounter by the fence were charged with unspoken anticipation. I had never realized I needed. "You are safe with me," Jacob murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. His words ignited a wave of warmth within me, prompting me to tighten my grip on him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I know," I replied softly, my voice steady despite the tempest of emotions swirling inside me. We moved together in a rhythm that felt instinctive, as if we had shared this moment countless times before. Each touch and whispered word deepened the bond between us, dismantling the barriers we had both constructed over the years. Jacob led me with a quiet assurance, his hands exploring with a tenderness that left me breathless. His touch was both firm and gentle, his movements deliberate yet unhurried, as if he wished to savor every second. "You are everything I have been searching for," he said softly, resting his forehead against mine. Tears threatened to spill from the corners of my eyes as his words enveloped me. Then Jacob crossed the room, his steps slow and deliberate until he stood directly in front of me. "Conrad," he said, his voice low and steady, "do you trust me?" I nodded without hesitation. "Yes." His hand reached out, brushing lightly against my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. "I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "You're not," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and desire. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile before he leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. His hands moved to my shoulders, gripping me gently as he deepened the kiss, his movements unhurried. I found myself enveloped in purpose as I melted into him, my hands instinctively reaching for his waist, drawing him closer until no space remained between us. The warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing anchored me in a way. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow through the delicate curtains of my room. Jacob remained still, his hands resting firmly on my shoulders, as if to ground me and anchor us both in that moment. The tension between us was palpable, a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, his voice steady yet laced with vulnerability. "I've never been more sure," I replied, my voice quiet but resolute. That was all the encouragement Jacob needed. He closed the small distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was no longer tentative or uncertain. It was profound and purposeful, filled with the unexpressed emotions we had both concealed for so long. His hands glided down my arms, his touch deliberate and slow, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. My heart raced as his movements grew bolder and more assured, yet they were never hurried. There was a tenderness in the way he guided me, a quiet reverence that made my chest ache. With a mixture of fear and longing, every touch, every whispered breath felt like a declaration, a promise that this moment belonged to us alone, separate from the world beyond these walls. "You're incredible," Jacob murmured against my lips, his hands settling at my waist. I could sense the strength in his grip, the quiet power that made him both steady and commanding. Yet beneath it all lay a gentleness that left me breathless, a softness that assured me I was safe and that he would not let me fall. Time seemed to dissolve as we surrendered to the rhythm of each other. The movements of my hands instinctively traveled to his chest, tracing the contours of the muscles hidden beneath his shirt. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm, serving as a grounding reminder of our reality, of our existence together. "Jacob," I whispered, my voice a soft plea that lingered in the space between us. He leaned back slightly, his gaze locking onto mine, his eyes radiating an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm here," he replied gently, his voice low and reassuring. The sincerity of his words tightened my chest, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. I leaned into him, allowing his presence to envelop me, his touch both comforting and steady as he held me close. The room around us faded away, the outside world becoming a distant memory as we surrendered to the magnetic pull between us. Each glance and every brush of skin heightened the tension, the quiet intimacy of the moment building to a crescendo that neither of us could resist. When we finally stilled, the only sound was the soft rhythm of our breathing, the steady beat of our hearts as we lay entwined. The weight of the moment settled over us, a silent understanding passing between us without the need for words. Jacob's hand moved to my face, his thumb gently caressing my cheek as he regarded me with a tenderness that made my heart ache.